Good morning everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. It has been chilly. It was negative 6.5 overnight, so it is still quite cool this morning. Out in the sun it's not too bad, but in the shade it's pretty chilly. So I'm under here with my beanie and stuff on, looking completely out of place, I'm sure, to all of those who are watching on the other side of the world at the moment. But it is chilly, so just gonna have to cope with that whole difference there. So today's video is about sourdough starter. So I said I was going to put together a week in the life of my sourdough starter to show people how I use it over the span of a week, the sort of rhythm that I use, because I use it directly from the fridge. I use plain flours. I use it in all different ways. So what I did was I recorded, it's about 10 days worth of using my starter. It doesn't cover everything I make, not by a long shot, but it does cover a wide range of different things that I do with it, and how I use it, and how I use it if I accidentally leave it sitting on a bench and it peaks and then flops, how I use it straight from the fridge, all that kind of thing. Some of the recipes that I use, that the starter isn't really the leavening agent, it's just a texture type thing, and somewhere it has to be, well, it's preferable for it to be at peak so that it helps with the bread and product and things like that. So it's basically 10 days of filming exactly what my starter is being used for. So I'm going to voice over it, and hopefully it all makes sense. I've already put all the video into a format so that it's in order, and then I've got my notes so that I can voice over in a way that it is in all order, and hopefully I'll cover everything, and any questions you have, you're more than welcome to ask in the comments. But hopefully this gives a good idea of how we use a sourdough starter here with the rhythm of a large family. We're off-grid, of course, but also that I don't baby it. There's a lot of people who get turned off by the idea of sourdough starters because they're using specialized flours, or they have to feed it at a certain time to use it at a certain time and all that sort of thing, and I am really lackluster with any of that sort of fancy type thing. Most of these 10 days are predominantly used with just plain flour from Costco, because I didn't even have any baker's flour, so it was just using whatever I had available, and you can see that it still had good results. So let's get started, and hopefully it all makes sense. Alrighty, we're starting off on day one making apple fritters. So the reason I started here was because I had accidentally left my starter on the bench instead of it going in the fridge. So it's quite sour, very liquidy, and still perfectly usable, but more usable for what people refer to as a discard recipe, though I'm not hugely fond of the idea of discard, because I don't actually discard my starter. So there's fed starter and unfed starter, and that's how I'm going to use it. I know that some people sort of have this issue with people not wanting to use the word discard, but to me discard means to throw away, and we're not throwing it away. So we're not discarding it in any way, we're just using it differently depending on what stage the starter was at. So the starter was accidentally left on the bench. It was very liquidy, very sour, so I wanted to use it all up so I could feed it to get a good consistency back for baking. You can just stick this in the fridge. It can live in the fridge for weeks, to be honest, and it just gets a bit of a grey gunge on the top that you can pour off or stir through and feed it, but at the same time, the more you feed it, the more extra food it's being given, and the healthier it is, like anything that's somewhat living. So one of the things that Darryl and the kids really love is apple fritters. I still had a whole bunch of apples from the hamper, so I went through and I cut them all up and put any that had some significant bruising and things like that in a bottle for some apple scrap vinegar, and then I grated the rest of them. You don't have to grate the apples, you can just cube them, slice them, whatever you want to do with them. I just happened to decide to grate these ones because I had the Thermomix there and it was nice and simple to do. So I grated them all up. It does mean that there's a fair bit of liquid when you grate them. If you cube them up, they're not releasing as much liquid as if you grate them, that sort of thing. So you do need to be aware of that when you're making it. So I poured all the starter I had in both jars, which I'm not sure how much was in here because I'm not sure how much had been used out of here. Just used all the starter that I had into the bowl with the apples and then assessed the texture. Once I did that, it was a little bit too thin. It wasn't going to hold together if I put it in oil. So I added a little bit of extra flour just to thicken it up to more of a batter type texture. And then I fried them. So you don't have to fry these in oil. I had the oil there. We'd made chicken the night before and I had strained this oil, so I had oil sitting there. But you could use them just as pancakes. That'd be perfectly fine as well. You could just put them in a pan flat as pancakes. So what you're looking for is sort of that pancake type thickness texture. That's what you're going for. So I added that little bit of flour to thicken it all up a little bit. If the starter hadn't been so thin, or if I hadn't have cubed the apples, it's really, you just want to make it sort of a pancake consistency. You want to be able to scoop it out, and if you put it on a hot pan or into hot oil, you don't want it to just spread everywhere. You want it to hold up a little bit. So I also added a couple of pinches of bicarb to the mix as well and mixed it through, and that's just because, as I said, this starter is very flat. There's not much leavening to it, so a bit of bicarb, baking powder, that sort of thing, like you would add if you were going to make pancakes. Then I just dropped about a quarter of a cup full into the oil, making sure not to overcrowd the pan because the temperature of the oil will drop too much then. Making sure the oil was nice and hot so they'd cook nice and quick. That way they're not sucking up as much oil, but also it means that the apple still has a bit of a crunch to it. You don't need to have the apple soggy. Like, you just want all the batter to be cooked, but if the apple still has a little bit of crunch, then I like it that way. Now, because I'm filming all of this in amongst my everyday life and everything else, you're going to get a lot of clutter on the benches and other projects going on in the background, and that's sort of what I wanted to show too, that it's part and parcel of the whole process, that your starter can be fed and used in amongst everything else that goes on in your daily kitchen rhythm and life. You need to build your rhythm so that it works for you, so that it's not adding work. It is, I suppose that's the whole point. It's not adding work. It's just becoming part and parcel of what you do on an everyday. So you need to figure out how it suits you. After we had cooked all the apple fritters off, I fed the starters. So there's just a scraping in the jar and up the sides of the jars because I just poured it into the thing. So all I do is I add 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water. My water is filtered from my Berkey, and I'm using plain flour from Costco at the moment because that's all I had. I do normally use baker's flour, but they didn't have any in stock last grocery trip, so I ran out. So I'm just using the simple plain flour. Everything in the video is baked with just plain flour as well because I didn't have anything else to use. So I did use filtered water from the Berkey. You do want to try and avoid chlorinated water if you can. But again, I know a lot of people who feed it straight out of the tap and don't have any issues. So there is a personal preference there to use filtered water, and theoretically your starter will be a bit healthier if it doesn't have the chlorine, because the chlorine could be killing off some of the bacteria that you're trying to grow. I mix up the jars really well, making sure that all the starter that's left behind gets mixed through the flour and the water, and make sure that all the flour is hydrated. I find that a spatula works really well, though I am going to look at splurging on one of those all-in-one silicone spatulas with the metal rod down the middle, because the ones with the removable heads get stuck in the jars sometimes because the starter's so viscous the head will pop off, and you have to make sure you clean the hole where the stick fits into as well, because otherwise if it pops off and you've got dirt in there, then that's going to contaminate your starter. So I'd really like a couple of those, the silicone all-in-one pieces with the metal rod down the middle. That's what I'm going to try and splurge on sometime soon to make it easier. I'll just have to keep it aside so it's used for my starter and the kids can't use it for everything else. Scrape down the jar as well as you can and put a breathable cover on it. I use patterned fabric because I have hundreds of meters of the fabric that I haven't got around to do anything with. Now, you can use a lid on it that doesn't have a seal on it. I don't do that because we get fruit flies. And you could use cheesecloth, you could use paper towel even, but I don't like paper towel because it sticks to the edge of the jar and it tears. The jars, you can swap your jars out. You can use a new jar whenever you want. I don't, mostly because I store my starter in the fridge most of the time anyway, and all those bits that dehydrate on the sides of the jars are basically dehydrated starter. So every now and again, I just pick them all off and stick them back in the bottom of the starter. Some people are going to really cringe at that, but it is what I do, and I'm being honest about that. Once it was fed, I put it aside on the bench. Now, because it was lovely and warm this day, I made the fritters at breakfast time. So I checked the timestamps and I fed the starter at about 11:20 a.m. So it was usable by 4:30 p.m, which tracks pretty normal. 6 hours at a moderate temp, sort of 20 to 28 Celsius, means that a healthy starter should double or triple. But you need to remember too here, this starter was well underfed and well flat, and it still tripled in the 6 hours. So as I said, the pedanticness is great. The scientific aspect of being pedantic in that's fine if that's what you want to do, but it really can be just used as is as well. So because it was ready to go, I made a couple of focaccias. So there is a whole video on how I make my focaccias. I basically mix all the ingredients into these bowls, into a shaggy mess, and then I cover it, and I come back after half an hour and I stretch and fold them, and then every half an hour I do coil folds. Now, the focaccias are a little more hands-on than a lot of my other bread, but there is plenty of focaccia recipes out there where you don't have to be hands-on, so that's personal preference. We have just found that this little bit of effort to make these makes them our favourite bread, so we do that. Focaccia doughs are fairly high hydration because they're not going to need to be shaped, they just get placed into a baking tray. They have a little bit of honey and a little bit of oil in them, which is just part and parcel of being a focaccia dough, and each one used about 100 grams of starter. So each jar has 300 odd grams of starter in it, so I used 200 grams out of one jar, leaving it about 100 grams, and the other jar has about 300 grams of starter. So all I did was I just covered the starters up and put them in the fridge, just as they are. So these are at peak, just happens to be at peak at this particular time, and I've got 100 grams in one, 300 grams in another, and I put them both in the fridge. Day 2. So the next day, the focaccias have been cooked, as you can see in the background, and I'm planning for day 3. So I didn't have any particular footage about the focaccias just here, but you can see them in the background there, that they've been cooked. So the next day they've been sorted and cooked. And then this is the evening of day 2. So what I've done is I've pulled the starter out of the fridge, just straight out of the fridge, and mixed up sourdough pizza dough. So I make a dough that is about 2 kilos, so that we have about 8 250 gram balls, which is a pizza for each of us, and then there's leftovers the next day for them to have for breakfast, because they like cold pizza for breakfast. I use 200 grams of starter in the dough. While it's cooler at night. I do use less in summer if I'm doing an overnight proof because it's a bit too warm. So I think I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again probably, that if you need to increase or decrease your starter amount, remember that your starter is just 50% flour, 50% water. So if I only wanted to use 100 grams starter, then I would use 50 grams extra flour, 50 grams of extra water to replace that 100 grams of starter. I use the KitchenAid for the pizza dough, as it's quite a large quantity, and I just want to bring it together well. And then it goes into a bowl, and no more hands-on work on that one. So it just goes into a bowl, and it gets covered in the compostable cling wrap that I've been using, or a lid, or whatever, something to seal it. I don't use cloth tea towels because I find that my dough dries out in our weather. But I use plastic, generally speaking, like compostable cling wrap, or a beeswax wrap, or a shower cap, or something like that, and then put it aside. While I was mixing it, I was making dinner. I think, but don't quote me on this, that we had soup with noodles and the bread for dinner. So I sliced up some of the focaccia for that and showed it off to the camera while the dough was kneading. Once the dough was where I wanted it, pulling away from the sides and climbing the hook in the middle, I oiled the bowl a little bit and covered it for overnight proof. So I don't leave my dough on the bench at the moment because it's warmer inside, but also because we have a couple of rodent issues at the moment. We have native bush rats that keep on getting onto the patio, and they knock things over. My starter jars and stuff, they like to knock them over. So I brought it inside to proof overnight. Both jars of starter are back in the fridge, so each one has about 100 grams of starter left in them. So I used 200 grams out of one this morning, 200 grams out of one this afternoon, so both have about 100 grams of starter left in them, and they've gone back into the fridge. Day 3. So I forgot to hit record on my camera. You would be in awe of how many times I managed to not hit record. But anyway, in the morning I got the pizza dough out of the bowl. I use a little flour if I have to, and I divide it into 8. I then turn each portion of the dough into a nice ball with some solid shaping, nice tight skin on it. I use semolina in the trays and over the dough to stop it from sticking to itself or the container excessively, and the dough goes into the fridge for the day. As I said, each of these balls are about 250 grams, so I put all 8 balls into the fridge until I'm ready to use them later on. So I didn't get footage of the shaping of those balls, but it's a fairly stiff dough, being a pizza dough, a little higher hydration than a boulet dough, but still fairly easy to handle. 8 balls into the fridge. You don't have to be particularly precise with that. About 30 minutes before I'm going to start cooking, I pull the dough balls out of the fridge just to come up to the room temp a little bit, which will make them easier to handle and stretch out. If they're too cold, they'll bounce back too much. You want them to warm up a little bit so that they're easier to stretch. I'm no fancy pizza tosser or anything. I just gently create a crust and then stretch the dough out with my fingers and my knuckles, and stopping if it feels like it's too much tension and turning. So if it feels like it's going to break instead of stretch, turn the dough, stretch, turn the dough, stretch. You just want to stretch it into whatever shape you want to use. I have a cutting board that I use as my pizza launcher for our barbecue top pizza oven. So I just know that I have to keep the sizing within that scope so that it'll fit in the pizza oven. I don't worry about the shape of it, to be honest. It ends up somewhat round. I just like to make sure that there's a bit of a roll on the edge to create a crust, and it's nice and flat in the middle so that it doesn't puff up in the middle of the toppings and move the toppings around. You can dock the middle of your pizzas if you want to. I don't bother, but you can use a fork and dock the middle of the pizzas. I try to make sure not to overload the toppings because the base isn't as thin as it could be, because it's sourdough, and it's cool and all the rest of it, and it's just the way we like them. So if you overdo the toppings, then your base might not cook all the way through. We do use the pizza oven with the pizza stone, so it's not as much of an issue, but it can be. If you let the dough sit for a little bit longer, it would be more malleable and you could stretch it more. So by the end pizza that I'm doing, generally speaking, they stretch out a little bit better than the beginning ones, but I'm making 8 pizzas and I get a little over it by then. So I just make sure not to overdo the toppings, which is fine. We do plenty of tasty toppings without overdoing the quantity of them. Day 4. So this is the evening of day 4. I haven't touched my starter since 2 days before. So this is day 4. Day 2 I made the pizza dough and it's been sitting in the fridge since then, and it still only has the 100 grams in each jar left in it after making the pizza dough and the focaccias and things like that. So I pulled both the jars out of the fridge, so we've got 100 grams of starter in each of them, and I used both the ends of both those jars to make bagel dough. Now, the reason I keep 2 jars going, I probably have mentioned it, but rather than one large jar, is that if the jar gets contaminated, the other one is still usable, and I'll use that to start a second jar. So if I had one jar and I left it on the bench and one of the native rats pushed it over, then that jar's become contaminated. And yes, you can scrape the top off, get a little bit from underneath and use that to create a new starter, but there's a risk to it. So what I like to do is have 2 jars going at the same time. They're both basically the same starter, but at least that way if one jar gets contaminated, I know that the other jar is fine. I did start a brand new starter a few videos ago to show you how it works, and one of these jars was that brand new starter, but I tend to use the same spatula now that I've finished the actual experimentation of making the starter and testing out the 2 of them for that video. Now I don't worry about keeping the spatulas separate or anything like that, so they're probably cross contaminated. That's not quite the right word because there's nothing wrong with them, but they're all the same starter basically by this point. So I don't keep them separate in that sort of anyway. So I use the KitchenAid to mix up the bagel dough. It's quite a firm dough, so doing it by hand is pretty hard. It's going to prove overnight as well. So I let it mix up, and while it was doing that, I scraped down and fed both the starters with the standard 150 grams of water, 150 grams of flour, again using plain flour. I use those ratios because I know that that's not going to overflow those particular jar sizes. So when I used to have one starter, I used a much larger jar and I just feed it 400 grams of flour and water. The more that you're feeding it, the longer it will take to get to peak because the bacteria has to colonate all of that and eat all of that. So 150 grams is a pretty quick double, especially in winter. It makes it easier in winter for me, and because I got the 2 jars and I know that if I feed it any more than that, we will have issues with overflow. And then I brought the jars and the dough inside to prove, because the weather's pretty cool, but also the bush rats still an issue and I don't want anything knocked over. Day 5, this is the next morning. So the dough has proved overnight for the bagels and is ready to be used. So I split the dough up into evenly sized balls. Sometimes I weigh them, sometimes I don't. It kind of depends on whether I've got room on my bench or not, to be honest. But I do the bagels at around about the 90 grams each, and that gives us enough that for the quantities for us to eat, like gives us a sort of an even amount of numbers for the 8 of us. So I pulled them all into balls, and then I let the balls sit for just 10 minutes just to let the gluten loosen up a little bit. After that, I use a little bit of flour on the mat. I pierce the middle of the ball with my thumb, and then I use both hands to stretch the center out and make a hole. I also spin it on the mat a little bit to try and get it somewhat evenly shaped around that hole. There are many, many different methods for shaping bagels. This is what I do and what I find helps. Yes, sometimes the internal hole splits a little bit in the middle there. Doesn't worry me. I'm not overly pedantic about it, but I find that this is a nice consistent way to get the hole dead center, to get the edges nice and puffy but the same sort of a width, the same diameter, circular. And I don't have a join where I'm joining two ends. That middle tear is the only sort of spot that it happens, so this is the way that I choose to do it. As I shape them, I place them on baking trays, a little bit of semolina sprinkled on the baking trays so they don't stick to the trays, and they're the trays that I'm going to use to bake them on, so it makes sense for me to do it that way. Each bagel requires a boiling time. The longer you boil them, the tougher the crust will be. So I tend to do about 30 seconds on each side. I started off at about 90 seconds when I first started making bagels, but I prefer it to have that little bit softer crust. So I do 30 seconds each side, flipping them after the 30 seconds, and then I remove them and put them on the baking tray and add the next lot. While that next lot is boiling, I top the other bagels. Topping them is personal preference. I've done cinnamon sugar before, I've done flaked salt, I've done all sorts of things. But what I do like to do is the everything but the bagel seasoning mix. So I make that myself. I'm pretty sure I've got it on the channel somewhere, but if not, I'll have to do a short for you. But I do everything but the bagel seasoning. I dip the bagel into the seasoning while the bagel is still damp, and then I put it back on the baking tray to go into the oven. Super simple. Some people season both sides of their bagels, but I find that the seeds burn on the bottom, especially because we use a barbecue to bake them. So I just do the top of them, and then they go in the oven. These are definitely best eaten the same day, but are nice toasted for a couple of days. And if any go stale, I love these as breadcrumbs because you get all that everything but the bagel seasoning in the breadcrumbs as well. They make fantastic breadcrumbs. We generally eat them as a breakfast / lunch food with bacon, eggs and mayo. That's sort of our favourite way to have them. I have again not hit record at the right time on my camera. As I said, you'll be in awe how many times I managed to do this, considering I have a camera going nearly all the time. I was cooking tuna bake while doing this that night. So the evening of day 5, the starters have tripled, and I used some of them to make brioche hamburger buns to prove overnight, and then put what's left of the starter in the fridge. So mixed up a batch of the brioche dough. I do a fairly light brioche dough. It does have some egg, some fat in it, but it's not excessive. It's a mix of water and coconut cream, and I much prefer that. I don't like it too heavy. So the starter was at peak because I'd fed it earlier, and then I made the brioche hamburger bun dough that will sit inside overnight, ready to use in the morning. Day 6, the starter went back in the fridge last night. Actually, I forgot to mention that. So after making the brioche dough, what was left of the starter went back in the fridge. And then on day 6 in the morning, I pulled the brioche dough out of the proving bowl and shaped it into hamburger buns. I like to do my buns about 90 to 100 grams each. I like to space them out in my tray so that they go wide instead of high because they're hamburger buns. If you make them smaller and put them closer together, you get kind of really lovely dinner style rolls. So I tend to do them sort of 50 grams, and then I put them in together in the tray so that they go up rather than out, and then they make really nice dinner rolls. Once they're shaped into whatever shape you want them, they need a second proving time. So, which works because I shape these in the morning and then I let them prove again until they're ready because we're having them for dinner. So it doesn't matter how long it takes because I can toast them later on if they get cold between when they're ready and when we're going to eat them. So once they've sort of doubled in size pretty much, that's when I bake them. I give them an egg wash and sprinkled with sesame seeds and then put them in the barbecue. These are a lovely soft bread roll without being too heavy. I don't like my brioche too heavy, as I said. I like an enriched dough for my hamburger buns, but not excessive. That I have tried some and I found them really crumbly and just too heavy. These are a really nice light one, and I'm pretty sure I've given the recipe before, but I definitely need to go through as I'm doing all this and try and provide some recipes for all of this stuff as well. It'd be wonderful if I could get the website going, wouldn't it? So hamburgers for dinner. That was day 6. Now on day 7, I pulled the starter out of the fridge. So obviously when I put the starter in the fridge the day before, it had already peaked and then fallen again, rather than putting it in the fridge at peak, which happens sometimes. I can be slack. So this would be what people would refer to as discard, that we were talking about. A lot of people would call this discard and wouldn't use it for standard baking purposes because it isn't at peak. They would discard a large quantity of this starter, feed it, and then wait for it to be at peak and then use it. And then use that discard however they wanted, or throw it out, depends on the person. Now, I don't really differentiate between fed and unfed starter. It just means that timing will be different. So if you're making a bread with an unfed starter, give yourself more time for it to prove, because that unfed starter is going to take time to get going. But you can make things that lend themselves more to unfed starter than fed starter. Not because it works differently, just because you aren't relying on the starter as the only leavening agent. Or you're not doing a long ferment, you're just doing a short ferment. So one of those things is pancakes. Pancakes made with sourdough starter, especially if you leave them overnight. Like if I make overnight sourdough pancakes, they are delicious, but you can make them same day as well. The starter gives them sort of a chewier texture. It is different. It makes them have a little bit of a bread texture, I suppose, rather than just a cake texture, which I prefer. It's a little bit of a toothier mouthfeel, less cakey, more chewy. It's not going to appeal to everyone, but that I really like sourdough pancakes because of that. So that morning I mixed up some pancake batter. You can use pretty much any pancake recipe you want, just remembering that for the amount of starter you are adding, you're removing half flour and half water, as we discussed before. So if you're going to use 100 grams of starter, you want to add 50 grams less flour, 50 grams less milk, or water, whatever your recipe calls for, to your recipe. And as like most pancake recipes, hold back a little on the liquid so you can add more if you want the texture the way you want. I like my pancake batter to be quite thick and viscous. I really like how it's gloppy, and then when you add it to the pan, then it thins out a little bit. I like my pancakes to lift a little bit rather than go flat, but that's personal preference. So you can use pretty much any pancake recipe you want, to be honest, to make sourdough pancakes. And if you're anything like me and you make pancakes regularly, I rarely use recipes anyway, because it's the same 3-4 ingredients. So you throw it all in and then you add a little bit of more flour, a little bit more milk, or whatever you need to get it to the consistency you want. That's how my grandmother taught me to make it anyway. So I used my KitchenAid to mix this batch of dough, as it was a bit large for my Thermomix, but both work well for the purpose. I also let the kids cook it off however they want. They wanted to make pancakes, that's fine. So once it was mixed, I put a tea towel over it and let it sit for as long as the kids could wait. As I said, overnight is really good, but if you can't leave it overnight, then don't. I always add the baking powder or the bicarb, or both if you're using both in your recipe, the next morning. If I'm going to leave the dough overnight, I mix everything up but the bicarb or baking powder, and then add that in the morning. But if you're only leaving it for 30 minutes, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. While it was resting though, I fed the starter that I'd emptied out, so I still had a jar that had peaked and fallen, was very thin and sloppy, but I wasn't going to get rid of it. I just put it in the fridge to use later for something, but this jar was now empty, so I got to feed it and get it going again. That afternoon, I mixed up some focaccias for the next day. Now, focaccia is a bread that kind of almost needs to overproof. It's a really high hydration dough that you want to get really bubbly, because that's what focaccia is. Because the weather is quite cold and we wanted to eat it during the day the next day, I used the starter I had fed and was at peak. I could have used the unfed one, but it would have taken longer to get ready to bake, so it probably wouldn't have been ready until mid-afternoon the next day by the time it hit the point that I wanted to bake it. So I had the option of the one that was at peak, so that's what I used for the focaccia. I mixed up the 2 bowls I used for it. As I said, there's a video start to finish of how I make the focaccia. Brought it together, and then throughout the evening I coil folded them in their bowls. Again, this focaccia is fairly hands-on. It doesn't have to be. There is plenty of no-knead focaccias out there if you want to make one of those. I coil folded them, as I said, every half an hour for a few hours, and then before I went to bed I put them in the baking trays that I'd bake them in the next day. I covered them with an upturned cookie sheets so nothing could get to them, and left them to proof overnight. As I said, you sort of, focaccia, you almost want to overproof. Not quite overproofing it, but you do want to get it further, take it further than you would a loaf, I suppose. I decided to use up the unfed starter and the last of the fed starter so that I could just feed them both up. So I made some pasta. I do a very simple pasta dough. It's 3 eggs, 100 grams of starter, 60 grams of oil, and 400 grams of plain flour. I use my Thermomix to bring it all together into a sort of that ball slash sandy sort of a texture. You could use a food processor, you could do it by hand, anything you want. When you're making sourdough pasta, you want it to be a little bit drier than if you were making standard pasta, because the starter will hydrate the flour a little bit more, and if you make it too wet to start with, it'll be quite sticky. So you're better to err on slightly more crumbly than you would think it should be. I used the rest of the starter to make 3 different batches of pasta. This is a really good way to just use up starter that you need to use. This and sourdough crackers and granola, neither of which I made in this video, but I will make at another time. So I brought the crumbled, the ball dough out of the Thermomix onto the dough mat and brought it all together into a disc shape. As I said, it'll look a little bit crumbly because it's a sourdough pasta, not a standard pasta, so it's a little bit dry, but it will hydrate and become lovely and silky. So I put it in a Ziploc bag to sit on the counter for a couple of hours, and then it'll go to the fridge. If the weather's humid or rainy, sometimes it's best not to roll it out because it can make it more difficult to handle, and the dough has a tendency to break when it's hung rather than drying. So it can go in the fridge for a few days. It's raw egg, so you need to be aware that there's raw egg in it, much like if you're making mayo or anything else. You know that it has sort of a 5-day lifespan, depending on how fresh your eggs were, 5-7 days sort of a lifespan. So that's personal preference there. I like to hang it on my pasta rack and then turn a fan on it till it just dries just a little bit, and then store it in the freezer. After I'd used up all the starter, I fed both jars again. 150 grams flour, 150 grams of water, again is the approximate quantities that I use because they won't overflow these jars. So that was the end of day 7. Day 8. The next morning, this is the focaccia dough. My timestamp says it's 9:30 a.m. So this was ready. Remember, I used peaked starter, so really well-timed starter. Made it the night before, left it out overnight. I used oil on my hands and dimpled the dough really well. I sprinkled some flaked salt, but you can top it with anything you want. Garlic and cherry tomatoes is lovely, fresh sprigs of rosemary, anything like that you want to use. Flake salt's just our simple go-to. Then I put it into the hooded barbecue to bake. After it was cooked, we sliced one of them up warm, which is very naughty. The texture of the bread is much better if you slice it after it has cooled, because if you're slicing it while it's warm, then you've got some steam issues and it can end up a little bit gluggy. But if you let it cool, then you don't have that problem. So you are better off letting it cool, but we were impatient. So focaccia is one of our favourite ways to eat sourdough at the moment. It's a little extra hands-on work to get it to this gorgeous consistency that we like, but we find it worth it. Though we can eat both loaves in one sitting with the 8 of us, which is not a good thing. Later that day, I pulled out one of the sourdough pasta hunks and rolled it out. So I used my KitchenAid attachment to roll pasta. This is not KitchenAid brand attachment though. It was a generic Amazon buy, stainless steel one. And I started at 8, which is the thickest setting on this particular roller, and then roll it, fold it, and roll it again on the 8, and then slowly go down in sizing from that 8 all the way down to 1. It will spring back a little bit, so even at 1 it's not as thin as a standard pasta dough quite often, but we like it that way anyway, and the texture's really good. So I take it all the way down to the 1. I use my pastry cutter to roughly cut it into strips, and then I hang it on the pasta rack. Fan nearby just to dry it to touchable texture, basically. You want it to dry so there's this tiny bit of a crust on it so it's not sticking to itself. I don't like to dry it fully because I find when I cook it from fully dried, it tends to fall apart on me. I don't know whether that's just sourdough pasta or standard pasta. I haven't done much experimenting, to be honest. But I just dry it till it has a skin on it so it won't stick to itself. And then I put it in Ziploc bags in the freezer in sizing suitable for serving sizes. That's our preferred way to store it. In our weather and environment, I'm not overly comfortable storing egg-based pastas on the shelves, even if I think they're completely dry. It just doesn't make sense to me for our environment. It's a lot of work to make the pasta dough, and if something goes moldy or whatever, then it's a loss of product. So I much prefer to freeze it. I reuse the Ziploc bags, I mark them with pasta, and then each time they just go back into a Ziploc bag and I pull them out to freeze the next lot of pasta in it. It does mean we don't do super large quantities because we don't have the room for it, but we do a few meals at a time, and that works out okay. What I didn't roll out went back in the fridge to roll out in the next day or two. As I said, it'll last quite a few days in the fridge, and it just depends on the time that I have. The starter headed to the fridge for the night as well. The next day is day 9, and that morning I made sourdough lard tortillas. So this is another thing that can be long fermented or short fermented. The starter helps with the texture and the hydration and stuff. This makes sense. If you've ever made sourdough, which I assume you have if you're watching this, when you mix up the dough initially by hand, it's all shaggy and there's no, it doesn't hold shape very well. It's just all shaggy and lumpy. But if you leave it for 30 minutes, when you come back to it and just pull the edges together, it's this real silky dough. And so by adding sourdough starter to a flour mixture, that's what you're doing. You're adding that texture benefit and stuff to it. So even if you're short fermenting, it can be worthwhile at times depending on what you're making. So I mixed up the lard tortillas. These are flour, lard, warm water, salt, and the sourdough starter. Very simple. I've got notes because I'm really happy with my recipe these days. So I brought it all together in the Thermomix, then hand kneaded it a little and wrapped it in the silicone dough mat to rest with a little bit of lard coating it so it doesn't dry out. After about that 30-minute mark, I divided it up into smaller balls, around about 50 grams each. I then put a bit of lard over those as well to keep them moist and so they don't get a skin on them, because that's going to impact you rolling them out. You can spray them with oil or something if you wanted, or whatever. I'm using lard in the tortillas, so I just used a little bit of lard over the top of them. The original time that I made lard tortillas was from Views on the Road here on YouTube, and that's what she does, and I find it works really well. Once the balls were done, so I just put the silicone mat over them while I got everything else set up and let them rest for a little bit. Again, I find that if you give them those little bits of rest time between handling the dough, it just makes them easier to roll out. They don't spring back as much. Then I came back and I cooked them. I rolled them really nice and thin, dipped them into a little bit of flour first and pinched the edges so the edges stay thin, and then roll. We don't worry about them being uniformly round or anything. None of us are overly concerned about it. Just want them really nice and thin so you can sort of see the marks on the dough mat underneath. They only take about 30 seconds each side in a piping hot cast iron pan to cook. So you just put them in, wait for them to bubble up, pat them down, flip them over, etc, etc. Super easy to make. I don't find a tortilla press works for my flour tortillas, only for corn tortillas, so I don't use it. I just do it all by hand. Once you get a bit of a rhythm down to it, it's not that hard, though this one batch is just one meal for us, so it's some people that would be far too much work. For me, in my situation, it wasn't too bad. You can stick them in the fridge too and warm them up to eat them next time if you were in a situation where you could make enough that you had that. The starter went back in the fridge at this point without feeding it again, so there was plenty left in the jars that I just stuck it straight back in the fridge, for use later on. That night I mixed up some brioche style dough for overnight proofing again, cleaning out what was left of the 2 starter jars to do so. So I pulled them out of the fridge, mixed up the dough. I used warm water for the dough as the temperatures overnight are getting pretty cold, and the starter was cold out of the fridge as well. So that way I'll get a good rise, a good kickstart to the fermentation at the beginning from the warm water. Enriched doughs are already a little slower to rise anyway than a standard dough, so this is just going to give it a little bit more oomph and make more likely to proof at a decent amount of time, that little bit of warm water. We're not running the fire. We are running the fire at night now, but we weren't at that point, so it was still pretty cold inside. While the KitchenAid needed the dough for me, I definitely use the KitchenAid for brioche doughs because you're incorporating fats and oils and stuff, so it's much easier to do that. I scraped down and fed both the starters. I used the warm water. It's not necessary, but I had warm water because I just warmed the kettle up. And I probably won't use the starter in the morning or anything, so realistically, if it took all day for the starter to peak, then it wouldn't matter, so I could have just used cold water. I happened to have the kettle there, so that's what I did. Fed them the usual 150 grams of flour, 150 grams of water, scraped them down, put the covers on them, and then brought them inside with the brioche dough for the evening. Then we have day 10. So this is the last day that I recorded for everyone. Even with the kickstart of the warm water on that brioche dough that I had proofed overnight, it was about 1 p.m. before the brioche dough was sort of puffy enough to be right for me. I kind of use my starter to judge the level of the dough as well by looking at where the starter was at peak for the dough, because in round bowls like I left the dough in, it's kind of hard to tell when a dough doubles. If you're fairly new to sourdough and you want a little bit more information, using a square or a straight-sided container works really well to tell how far your dough has proved, because it's going to lift up the sides uniformly, whereas rounded bowls are wider at the top than they are at the bottom, so it's harder to tell that proof. So a straight-sided container is much better, or you can do what I did here, basically feed the starter and use the starter as a judgment point. So the starter had peaked, and so I went, well, I'm pretty sure the dough is where I need it to be, so we will use it now. I turned the dough out onto the dough mat, and I split it in half. This was a double batch of brioche dough. It is rare that I make a single batch. If I'm making dough, I may as well make double and do something with it. So this was a double batch of dough. I split it in half. The first half I rolled out into a rectangle, stretching and rolling it as I needed to get a fairly uniform thickness. I then put a layer of ground almonds and raw sugar over the dough. I used my TriBest personal blender, and I just put almonds and raw sugar in it and ground them up into a powder. So I poured that over the top of the dough, and then I used a layer of stewed apples. So I have apples stewed on my shelf that I need to get used before this year's apple season, so I'm just using them in a variety of ways. I don't add any sugar to my stewed apples when I can them, so that little bit of sugar on the dough will be all that I will have needed to just sweeten that slightly, and it will also help to soak up any excess liquid. So the apples are fairly wet. I could have strained them, I suppose, but the extra juice is nice. It all sort of caramelized on the bottom of the baking tray, but the almonds will help soak up some of that liquid and stop the dough from going soggy as well. I rolled it into a log, and then I sliced it. I find a serrated bread knife is the easiest thing here to slice it without skewing or squishing the dough, but I know that a lot of people use like dental floss or fishing line or something like that. I don't have any of that handy, so I use a serrated knife. I just make sure not to cut all the way through to the dough mat, because you don't want to cut your dough mat, so I use a plastic dough cutter for the very bottom bit if I need to. I arranged all the scrolls into the cast iron pan and covered it to do its second proof. So it's going to take as long as it takes to double up again. I turned the other half of the dough and split it into rolls. I probably should have done the 16 dinner rolls like I was talking about, but I just wasn't sure what I was going to use it for, so I ended up just doing the 8 rolls. We did end up eating this with pork soup off the shelves, so as I said, I probably could have done it into dinner roll size. I put them on the baking tray for their second proof as well. Once the dough had doubled in their respective trays, I baked them. They both double at much the same rate because it's the same dough and that sort of the same weather, all the rest of it. I mixed the rest of the almond and sugar mix that I had left in the blender with a bit of coconut cream and used it for icing on the apple scrolls. Just, totally decadent, super tasty. The rolls are a lovely texture, soft, but they don't crumble. And again, not too heavy a brioche. This is the standard brioche recipe that I use for my bread rolls as well as these scrolls, though sometimes I don't even use a brioche recipe for the scrolls either. It's just a standard dough, but it is nice to use the brioche recipe at times, and I'm really looking forward to doing a chocolatey one. Maybe I'll do that for my birthday. So that was that. So that was 10 days of fairly heavy usage of the sourdough starter, but also it spent a lot of time in the fridge. This was the end of my 6-week grocery period, so we rely on bread a little more heavily towards the end of the 6 weeks than we do at the beginning. That's our sort of bulker for bulking up meals when we're low on excess meats and things like that. We definitely go through a cycle of, we don't use as much bread at the beginning of the month because I don't have the time to do it in amongst everything else, but we also have all those fresh veggies and stuff like that at the beginning of the month that we don't necessarily have at the end of the month. So we rely on bread a bit more heavily. We're using plenty of veggies, like we had the bread with the soup full of veggies off the shelf, but they're not fresh veggies. So we have soup from the shelf, bit of bread. Anyway, so it was 10 days of fairly heavy usage, but I did that on purpose because I wanted to show how it could be used in the rhythm of everyday life, going in the fridge and out of the fridge. Sometimes I forgot to put it in the fridge, things like that, and how it was still perfectly usable in a range of things. I do make a lot more other things with my starter as well. I don't make boules that often, but I do make boule round loaves because I have enamel billy tins that I use in the wood stove. We don't have any wood to use the wood stove at the moment though, because our chainsaw chain broke and we're picking some up from the post office today. So I haven't been using the wood stove for that. I am going to try and make some petards, some of the longer loaves. I have my eye on a couple of things to try that because I'm curious as to whether I prefer them to rounds. I dislike the way a round cuts, to be honest. I have made some sandwich dough loaves, but I've never made one that I'm particularly happy with yet. I'm still working on that. We make sourdough crackers and granola. I've made brownies, biscotti, chocolate chip cookies, all those sorts of things, any of that. But the things that I made in this video are probably the most common things that we make. The focaccia, the hamburger buns, the pasta. I don't know what else I made. Scrolls. But they're the main things that we make. So hopefully that's given you an idea of how you can incorporate it in your general kitchen rhythm without making it an added task. That's the whole point. It's not an added task. It just becomes part and parcel of your day. So hopefully that's helped. Ask any questions you want in the comments and let me know if this video helped or not, or if it was worthwhile making, because it was a lot of effort and I hope it worked the way I was hoping it did, but I don't know. So I'll see you guys on the next video. Bye guys.